Welcome to the Lessons from Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Brian Beckcom. Well, it's been a month or so since I have released a podcast. I've been super duper busy with some issues that I will talk about in later podcasts. But without further ado, my next guest is Bishoy Tadros. Bishoy was born in Egypt, and at the age of 3, his family uprooted and immigrated to the United States after he received a cancer diagnosis. He had treatment on and off for 10 years. On his 13th birthday, he underwent brain surgery for what was eventually revealed as a golf ball-sized blood clot, and then was given a clean bill of health. Because he spent his childhood battling cancer, Bishoy was never able to unleash his full potential. In his adult years, he set out to unleash that potential. Bishoy worked at JP Morgan. He worked at Salesforce. He's the author of 2 books, Break Barriers, How Setbacks Can Dare You Rather Than Define You, and Audacious, Uncaging Your Authentic Self. He's also the host of the Mile 40 podcast. I was on Bishoy's podcast about 2 months ago, and I liked him so much I asked him to come on mine. In the show, we talk mainly about overcoming obstacles, difficulties, challenges, what it takes to mentally overcome that voice in your head that says you can't do the things you want to do, how to be happy, how to be an athlete in later age, and so much more good stuff. And now I give you Bishoy Tadros. Hello, everybody. This is Brian Beckcom, and I have got Bishoy Tadros. Bishoy and I actually met a couple months ago because he was kind enough to invite me on his podcast, the Mile 40 podcast, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But we had such a good time that we decided to do it again, only now we're switching places. So Bishoy is going to be my guest on this podcast, and I was a guest on his podcast. By the way, for everybody that's listening, Bishoy's podcast and I are very similar in a lot of ways. So if you're looking for a similar podcast, the Mile 40 podcast is a great podcast. Bishoy, how you doing today, man?
Brian, I'm great. I'm excited to get in here. I'm grateful for the opportunity. I had mentioned to you prior to this that, your audience should hear. One of the things that really stood out about you was just how philosophical you are. A lot of times, guests are used to coming on shows and they have their expected questions and answers, whereas I felt like I was on the hot seat on my own show speaking to you at times. And honestly, that kind of challenge is riveting for a host, as I'm sure I think you would feel the same way.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we really connected, and maybe part of being on the hot seat is that trial lawyer mentality that I have. Yeah, I was actually having dinner with my son. I just dropped my younger son off at college this weekend, and we were having dinner with some people, and he used the word allegedly multiple times. And one of the ladies was like, "You must be a lawyer's son." And actually, my wife is a lawyer too, so we don't even notice that. But it's great to see you. You've got a incredible life history. You were born in Egypt. You're a childhood cancer survivor. You've raised a lot of money for cancer research. You have had a really interesting professional career. So you started at JP Morgan and were in finance, and then you move over to the tech industry. You move over to Salesforce.
Yeah.
And you have a podcast, and you also have 2 books, 2 great books that I want to talk about. So tell us a little bit about who you are, where you came from, how you got to where you are today.
Absolutely. So like you mentioned, I was born in Egypt. When I was 3 years old, I was diagnosed with leukemia. And that's where it all began. My parents made the decision to leave everything that they had ever known. They didn't know anything outside the country, outside of, their travels, because they realized back in 1990 that the only chance of survival was going to be here in the States. And so they made the decision, and essentially had to figure it out piece by piece. They moved to California, the city of hope, where I did a year of treatment. And then ultimately after that, I moved to Long Island, where I finished my treatment at North Shore, which is now known as Northwell out here. So between the ages of 3 and 13, I had been undergoing chemo, radiation. When I was 13 years old, I had brain surgery to remove a golf ball sized mass. It was called a venous hemangioma from the right frontal lobe of my brain. But what I like to call out about this narrative and, where it really comes together isn't so much about the biographical parts of the story, but it was essentially about this young boy who, no matter what he was doing, whether it was academically, socially, physically, athletically, it just wasn't clicking. Nothing was working out. I wanted nothing more than to be like everybody else, competing and playing. The phrase of you can't, you won't, you shouldn't, maybe one day, that was what I was used to hearing from everybody outside of my parents. My parents had always believed there would come a time for me. And they implanted this notion that I was dealt the hand that I was given because I was built to play it. And it was that perspective that helped shape me over time. I came out of that brain surgery, and in Break Barriers, my first book, I talk about being in that recovery room and just how painful it is coming out of an 8-hour surgery, especially a brain surgery, because you're taped up from top to bottom, and it hurts to breathe because your body is just so swollen. And I talk about the darkness of that moment. I was in the recovery room with another pediatric patient who was suffering from a seizure at the time. And your brain goes to such a dark place. You start to think it's either going to be him or me. We both can't make it out of this moment. And it was in that period where I had made a promise to myself and essentially built this mantra of breaking barriers. And I promised myself that coming out of that surgery, anything life put in front of me at that point, I was going to figure out a way to overcome. And everything goes back to the lessons that my parents had taught me, and they probably didn't realize how much I was listening as I was going through, all the obstacles. But small things like celebrating small wins, understanding that failure is an important a part of the path on the way towards success. So now I'm headed into high school, and first things first, I need to make some friends because I've had such a hard time making friends leading up to that point in my life, just because I was so different for so many reasons. And I had built up a temperament that accepted that I was going to be rejected. So I was going around trying to befriend whoever, and I just let it slide off my back anytime, people didn't want to hang out with me or people didn't want to socialize with me or we couldn't find commonalities. And I wanted to play sports. And, I joke now because I'm a big runner, but I was always the last guy on the suicide lines. And I never understood why. I always wanted to play basketball as a child. I was the first person, in the gym, last person out, but no matter what, I was always the last guy on those suicide lines. And it's hard to explain to a child how chemotherapy, could impact them. And I couldn't really digest it at the time. And so now I'm in high school, and the school I went to, St. Anthony's out on Long Island, it's a big Friday night light type of institution. Football is huge over there. And I just wanted to be a part of a team. I wanted nothing more than to be a part of a locker room. And I talk about how I'm the only person that ever got cut from this football team. And I got caught twice, but I showed up the third time and
Yeah.
I made it that third time. And if it wasn't for this mentality of you need to fail or you need to be broken in order to get yourself back together and understand, how far your foundation can take you, then, my life would have been shaped a lot differently. So that's a little bit about my earlier life. But I think it's important to kind of give that backdrop because that's where everything really started, going through what I had went through, making this promise to myself, and then employing the lessons at an early age and really, really embracing failure.
It's amazing to me, Bishoy, historically, you and I share a similar background insofar as we both had, I guess, what psychologists would refer to as childhood trauma, or we had difficult situations when we were very young. I had a mother going through cancer, and you were going through cancer yourself. And, it's amazing how many people that are very, very successful have some sort of major childhood trauma. Like, for example, if you can look behind me, you can see Winston Churchill, who's one of my
Mhm.
heroes. He had an extremely, extremely problematic childhood. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a terrible, terrible father. He was not a good father. And Churchill ends up being this amazingly successful person. And you could go throughout history and you can see people that have experienced very, very difficult things when they were younger tend to be more driven when they're older. And, I look back on my experience and, at the time, you're too young to really have the wisdom to process
Yeah.
this. But the older I get, the more I realize that not only are the obstacles important, but the obstacles are the point. Like the point of doing things is to do hard things. And if you
Yeah.
do hard things, you're not always going to succeed. But the only way to do something that's meaningful is to do something that's hard. And I'm like right in the middle of that with my children right now. So I've got two boys. Both of them go to Texas A&M. Both of them are in the Corps of Cadets, which is a 24-hour, 7-day a week military organization. And I did the same thing. My dad did the same thing. My grandfather did the same thing. But my dad gave me a book called Never, Never Quit in 1992, and he inscribed a message. And the basic point of the message was persistence wins. Persistence wins, not talent. I
Yeah.
got two copies of that book off of eBay, and I gave both. I gave one to my older son 2 years ago and one to my younger son this weekend. And so let's really explore, if you don't mind, I want to explore like head on why it's so important for people to build, whether you want to call it resiliency or whatever. As we talk about this, I'm reminded of a great Bruce Lee quote, and I'll paraphrase it because I don't know the exact quote, but when my oldest child was going off to college, I was a little bit upset. I was worried about him. Of course, you want to be there, you want to protect him. And Bruce Lee said, don't wish an easy life for the people that you love. Wish a hard life with the skills to overcome the difficulties. So, talk about your message, which I think is so important in terms of overcoming obstacles, doing hard things, learning from so called failures. Tell us about that a little bit, Bishoy.
Yeah. Oh man, you said so many wonderful things. Look, the idea of persistence wins. It's a sexy tagline to some people, but if you know, you know. Like
Yeah.
if you know what you can accomplish with persistence, you never look back. And a big foundation of that, to your point, is around if you've been broken historically and you go back to that childhood trauma respectively, it's a cheat code because like I can't I don't get phased because you can't break me. And that's not to sound arrogant. It's to sound it's to let other people know that it's okay to be broken.
Yeah.
Because that experience is what has essentially instilled the strength and the fortitude and the resilience to get back up. And that's in every element of life. And I could take this in so many different directions. We could talk about something as high level as a podcast, and I'm sure you know this. The only way to succeed podcasting is to be persistent.
Yeah.
It could, be about something like running marathons. And actually, right before you and I came on earlier this morning, I had Ashton Eaton, the gold medal decathlete from 2012 and 2016, come on mile 40.
Nice.
And him and I met in 2017. And in 2017, I ran my first marathon. I ran that marathon in 4 hours and 40 minutes because I had carried the burden of my entire life being told you don't belong on these courses.
Yeah.
And just 2 months ago, I PR'd with a 3:28 in London. So I shaved
Wow.
off over an hour and 10 minutes, on my time. But that took 7 years. That took
Yeah.
7 years of continuing to show up for a sport that I was told over and over again that I don't belong on the course for, right? And
Yeah.
and so it goes through everything. But I'm gonna, give you an important story, and I think this is at the crux of everything. So in my mid 20s, I'm in the city, like you had mentioned earlier. I'm in New York. I had been working in banking. Banking absolutely crushed my soul. I mean, it's good money, but there was absolutely no fulfillment in the career. I found no joy in playing the game. I thought a lot of things were broken institutionally. And so I needed to find something to keep myself stimulated and rooting for just a better outcome, not just for myself, but for the people around me. And banking, quite frankly, was demoralizing. So I started to revisit my athletic ambitions. And a friend of mine at the time, this was about 2014, 2015, boutique fitness was up and coming in New York City. A lot of different studios were coming up. He had opened up a new spin studio with a team-based concept. And I didn't really have a cycling background or anything like that, but I knew I wanted to get back in the world of fitness. So I started going to these classes, and what I liked about these classes was they were in dark rooms, no one could really see you, but there was a scoreboard on top, and
Yeah.
your bike number would show your score on the scoreboard. And you'd be riding collectively with a group of about 15 other people and competing. And a couple of things that I realized, when I was doing these 5, 6 a.m. workouts. One, I realized that I was competing, I wasn't, at the bottom of the leaderboard. So I was surprising myself a little bit. But the other thing I realized was I was surrounded by quote unquote real athletes, like college athletes, even some professional athletes. And what I started to realize at that point was people who had excelled in their crafts, especially in the world of fitness and athletics, those aren't the people who are necessarily going to bring you down. Those are generally the people who are going to want to pull you up. So what you need to do is you need to find that group of people, surround yourself by those people, and quite frankly, stay quiet and just listen, learn. You could ask questions, but you know, understand that you're there to soak in what they have to offer because they've been through it. So I kept going. And ultimately, this group of people started getting into the triathlon circuits. And they were the people who got me to sign up for my very first half marathon. But after doing a couple races, this was the winter of December of 2016, they had encouraged me to sign up for a half Ironman. And, I tell people, you may know me now and you may think, of course he did that. But if you had known me in 2016, you had known me at any point in my life leading up to 2016, you would have thought I was a maniac because there was no part of my resume that suggested that I would ever be on a course like that, doing anything like that, a 70.3 mile race. And so for 6 months, I shut it down. I wasn't going out, absolutely no alcohol. I was training twice a day. I was extremely regimented. I talk about how I was single at the time, and my mother was getting concerned because she thought all I was doing was working out and essentially obsessing about this race that I had signed up for. And for 6 months, people kept asking me, why are you doing this? And truth be told, Brian, I couldn't answer the question. I didn't really know why I was doing it. In my heart of hearts, I felt like I had to be doing it. I knew it was something that I should be doing, but I didn't have an answer as to why. And I was really struggling with that because, as I had mentioned earlier, the fact that you're philosophical in nature is something that's really appealing to me. I consider myself to be philosophical. I love asking the question why, and I was actually frustrated because I couldn't answer that question. So fast forward to race day. It's 90 degrees outside. The race is in Maryland. For me, the swim was supposed to be the hardest portion. It's a 1.2 mile swim, half against the current, half with the current. I got out of the swim portion in about an hour and 8 minutes, and now I'm transitioning to the bike, a 56-mile bike ride. And, I again didn't really know much about the sport at the time, but the studio that I rented my bike from, it was the same week as the New York City bike tour, and they had sent me a hybrid instead of a road bike. And for anyone that knows anything about bikes, which I didn't know enough at the time, it's like ordering a Ferrari and getting a beat up minivan. So now I'm pounding away at this bike in 90-degree heat. And in my head, the question is starting to come up, why did you do this? And I just kind of kept suppressing it, suppressing it, suppressing it. And around mile 40, I completely broke down. Salt all over my skin, completely dehydrated. There was no thought of any sort of time goal at this point. Everybody had flown past me. And there I was asking myself, dude, how did you get yourself into this situation? You paid, I don't know how many $100s. You shut things down for 6 months. People kept asking you, why are you doing this? You didn't have an answer for them. You don't even really know why you're doing this. And so now I'm about to turn 30 years old. I remember the race was in June. I was turning 30 in August. And I had a moment where I thought to myself, my mom's at the finish line. She'd be thrilled if I called her and said, let's get out of here. But I also, for the very first time in my adult life, kind of went into this fight or flight situation where when your back is up against a wall like that, you start to dig deep for any sort of mechanism to get yourself out of the situation. And that's when I started to kind of think, and for the first time, transcended time and thought about that young boy. And I said to myself, if he went through what he went through, if he got out of that operating room, if he handled those spinal taps, if he handled all that rejection, you know, constantly isolated out on the playground, no one wanted to speak with him, always last on those suicide lines. This man can figure out how to get through this moment. And that's when I picked up on some of those items that I had alluded to earlier, celebrating small wins. And immediately my mind went to, you have 30 miles left to finish this race. Instead of looking at it as 30 more miles, what you're going to do is you're going to look at it as 1 mile 30 times, and you're going to celebrate every single mile. And mentally, that's essentially how I finished the race. I think it took me a little over 8 hours. But what was really special about that was I got through that finish line, and I think people felt bad for me. But I had never felt more empowered in my
Yeah.
entire life because I finally cracked the code. I finally found that I had this strength within me that I had been carrying for 30 years, that I hadn't told anyone about, that I can do hard things, that I could put myself in these crazy situations, and my mind can not only get me out of them, but can get me out of them stronger and better positioned for literally everything that came in my life thereafter. So that's why the podcast is called Mile 40, because after several years and a couple other things that we'll dive into, it became evident to me that the one thing that unifies us all as humans is that we all have moments where we bottom out. And if we take a second to dig deep, we all can overcome those obstacles in unique ways. And for me, that was, channeling the lessons that my parents taught me.
What a fantastic answer. And you said a lot of things in there, and I want to unpack that a little bit. So there's a I have a similar story. There's a great saying that I try to keep in mind. I've tried to keep this in mind last 4 or 5 years. The cave you fear to enter holds the gold you seek. And what that means to me is often the things that I'm most afraid of are precisely the things that I should be doing. And I've told this story a bunch publicly, but I started martial arts, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at 47 years old, about 5 years ago. One of the oldest guys in there. Unlike you, I was actually a athlete when I was younger. I played college basketball, played high school basketball, have been an athlete throughout my adult life in different sports, but I'd never done martial arts like that before. And I felt I didn't know a single person when I walked in there. I look around, there's all these 25-year-old Brazilian guys that look like they could kill you with one look. And I felt like a complete fool, quite frankly. And I got my butt kicked for about 6 months. And then 6 months in, we were at the end of class, and my professor, who's now become a good friend of mine, promoted me. He gave me what's called a stripe on my belt. Okay.
Mm.
And all it is a piece of tape to indicate that I had been training for a certain period of time. So I hop in my car and I'm driving home, and I just start breaking down crying uncontrollably. I could not stop crying, and I was crying tears of joy. I could not believe how overjoyed I was. I actually ended up calling my dad, and I was literally bawling my eyes out. I said, Dad, I just accomplished something that almost no 48-year-olds will ever accomplish. And it was like this feeling of euphoria that I had. And as I look back on it, I was like, well, this is just like basketball. This is just like the Corps of Cadets. I just went through something that was very, very, very difficult that most people are not willing to do. And I did it with a group of people that have become very close friends of mine. And that's why I was so overjoyed. And then a year or so later, I was convinced by some of my jujitsu friends to enter a jujitsu tournament in Dallas.
Mm.
And so I drove 5 hours to Dallas. I trained for this thing for months, diet, just like you said, diet, cutting way, way back on alcohol, worrying about sleep. I was going and getting private lessons, developing strategy and all that. And I drive up to Dallas the night before the tournament. And the night before the tournament, if you could have put a microphone up to my brain and heard the thoughts
Mm.
that were going through my brain, it was stuff like this. How do I get out of this? What an idiot. What are you doing at 48 years old fighting in a tournament? You're a fool. Maybe you can claim that you're injured. Nobody's going to care if you're injured. If you're injured, you can back out of this. And I mean, it was like the worst, most negative self talk you could possibly imagine. But I got up the next day and I went over there and I competed and I did really good. And as I'm driving back home to Houston that night, it was the same feeling of euphoria. A bunch of my buddies were calling me. I was driving back. I felt like I was on top of the world. I pull into my house. All three of my kids are waiting for me to give me a big hug. We're so proud of you, Dad. But again, I was scared to death the night before that tournament. And it's the same thing for me, quite frankly, before I go to trial. My day
Mm.
job is a trial lawyer. And when I go to court on a big case and I've got somebody's financial future on the line, the night before trial is terrible. All I
Mm.
think about is all the bad things that could happen. And,
Yeah.
I've done this so many times, been practicing lawyer for 25 years now. I still sit there the night before a court case and I wonder what happens if the words don't come out of like what happens if I just freeze up or forget what I'm going to say or I'm sweaty or anything like that. The funny thing, Bishoy, is I've done this for 25 years and I've never froze up. I've never forgotten the words, but my
Yeah.
brain still seeks out this negativity. And, I want to go somewhere in just a second with this, but the point is the whole point of what we're talking about is to overcome those thoughts. Like once you've done that and proven to yourself you can overcome that, then it gets easier and easier. They say the definition of courage is not the absence of fear; it's having fear and doing it anyway. But let me ask you a question, because one of the things that you do, which I think is awesome, is you coach other people on some of these philosophical and practical things we're talking about. And my dad used to say when I was younger, he said the people that he respected the most are people that came from nothing and made something of themselves, and people that were given everything and made something of themselves.
Yeah.
And it's not until I become a little bit older and that the second part of that has made a lot of sense. It totally makes sense to everybody that if you overcome a lot of challenges, generally speaking, people respect that. But what do you tell people? And I've worried about this with my kids who haven't faced who haven't faced childhood cancer, who haven't lost a parent. My kids have lived. My both parents are together, and we live
Yeah.
in a nice neighborhood and all that. And they really haven't had to struggle. Now, I will tell you, both of my boys ended up choosing to join the hardest and most meaningful college organization in the country, the Corps Cadets at Texas A&M. So that's how they've
Yeah.
overcome some of that stuff. But what do you tell people who haven't had those experiences, that don't know that they have a extra gear, or that they can overcome way more than they maybe realize?
It's a great question. I think people who are around me and who know me know that if I could say to be scared of one thing, it's to be scared of complacency. And
Yeah.
if you catch yourself, complacent in any element of your life, that's the trigger to action. That's the call to seek something, right? And a lot of times it calls for you to get outside your comfort zone, and to do something that perhaps you aren't used to doing. And I had mentioned before we hopped on, I have a 2-year-old, I have another child on the way, and that's something that I hope to instill in my children, is this idea of, you know, it's okay to be proud of your accomplishments. It's never okay to be complacent.
Yeah.
And to your point, God willing, my kids are healthy, they're going to be dealt a better hand than I was dealt. And I
Yeah.
think about that. I definitely think about that. My parents immigrated, they were fortunate enough to have the support of their parents. But again, the dollar back then, they didn't have much. They had to
Yeah.
figure it out. They had to figure out the finances, the healthcare, everything like that. And it all could have, basically came rocking down on them. But fortunately, they figured it out and they got situated as immigrants. Whereas my children are going to be more fortunate from that perspective. And it's something that I definitely think about. But I think instilling that attitude toward complacency is the first step. And when I speak with people, one of the first things that I do is I ask them, what it is that's going right in their life and what it is that's going, wrong in their life and what it is that they want to address and what steps they've taken to address those things that are going wrong. And are they finding themselves in a pattern of just repeating the same motion? It's the whole idea of insanity, right? If something's going
Yeah.
wrong with your life and you're attacking it the same way every time and seeing the same results, then maybe you need to take a step back and maybe consider doing something you're a little bit less comfortable with.
Yeah.
Um, and I think sometimes it's about taking those baby steps. And so, for example, take the idea of training for a marathon, because I do work with people who want to, run their first marathon, for instance, right? And I learned this the hard way, over, now several years of training. But the key to becoming good at marathon running is to actually train slow. You train slow to run fast. It's counterintuitive,
Yeah.
but it actually transcends marathon training, the whole concept, right?
Sure.
The whole idea of, in order to be a fast runner, you need to train with a low heart rate. You need to maximize your time out on those runs. It's not to go out there and try to run your fastest 26 miles the first day you're training.
Yeah.
And to a lot of people, that's uncomfortable for many reasons. It's uncomfortable because in their minds they think, "Oh, like how am I ever going to be a fast runner if I'm training slow?" Also, a lot of people are not comfortable spending that much time alone with themselves. And the inability to be introspective on those runs because they are questioning, the mechanics behind it. And so, long-winded way of just saying that it all comes to complacency. Um, if you can really implant that idea in your head that being complacent is unacceptable, then at least you have a trigger warning that calls to action.
It's interesting you'd say that about slow is fast. It's the same thing in the two sports that I currently participate in, golf and jujitsu. As you get better in jujitsu, ironically, you move slower.
Hmm.
And there's lots of reasons for that. One reason, of course, is your technique is way better, your confidence is better. But we have a joke about, we call them spazzy white belts. So they come in there, and I was the same way. Everybody's the same way, pretty much. And you think if you move super fast that suddenly you're going to be better. And what you realize after a little while is there's always going to be somebody faster than you, right?
Yeah.
There's always going to be somebody that can move quicker than you. And when you move fast like that, you run out of energy very, very quickly. And so the best jujitsu guys don't rely on pure speed. They rely on technique, they rely on control. And it's the same way with the golf swing. If you watch the guys that hit the golf ball the farthest on tour, 300 plus yards, they don't swing it back as fast as they possibly can and forward as fast as they possibly can. In fact, they bring it back in the backswing in a very slow and controlled manner on a certain plane. And I'm going to go into some physics here. And they set certain angles and then they release those angles at the same time. And it literally looks like they're swinging slower than the people that aren't hitting it as far as they am. It's the same thing with basketball. I don't know how much you're into
I
basketball,
am,
but
yeah, big Knicks
yeah,
fan.
yeah, okay. So if you watch a really good college basketball game or a really good pro basketball game, you will see that those guys are actually they're moving very fast, but it's a very controlled
Yeah,
speed. And in
absolutely.
fact, one of the things that makes people like Luka Doncic so good and James Harden, some of those guys, is they can slow down when everybody else is going fast. And
Yeah.
I think there's so many parallels to life in general that you can get out of sports. But yeah, slow and deliberate. Usually, I mean, it's like it's the tortoise and the hare analogy that we've had out there for 500 years.
Yep.
But I'll tell you one thing that uh, I've noticed with my kids, and I noticed with my dad. So kids really don't listen to what you say. They kind of watch what you do.
I watch what you
And
do.
and so I grew up, my dad was a runner. My dad ran, he's a big guy. He was 6'2", 210 pounds, but he loved to run. He ran 3 marathons. His last marathon, he broke 4 hours, which was a big goal of his. And he's 81 years old and he still works out and he works out on a treadmill. Last year he was on the treadmill and he had some sort of event where he just fell and it looks like I mean, he fell, landed on his face. He looked like he got hit by 15
Mm,
bricks. He looked like he got in a fight.
mm,
And so what did he do after that? Well, he obviously went to the hospital, but then when he got back, he was like, I'm going to continue to train. And so now he wears a football helmet with a face mask when he's on the treadmill, just in case he falls. He says, I will be in the hospital room at 90 years old and I will have the nurses bring me two-pound dumbbells so I can at least get some workout in. And that seeing that from my dad, I noticed you've got a bunch of medals on the right behind you. My dad's got the same thing. He's got a list of medals that he's won over 50. He's got like 25 of these. But seeing that is way more impactful than hearing him talk about it. And I think one of the reasons that my boys chose something hard in college instead of something easy is because they saw their 48-year-old dad doing jujitsu. I
yeah.
wasn't talking about doing hard things. I wasn't saying you need to do hard. And then meanwhile, coming home and getting drunk every single night on the couch, I was I was doing them, and they saw that. And I think whether it's conscious or subconscious, that has a big effect on people. And I'll tell you the other thing that you mentioned earlier, which I think is great that I want to talk about just a little bit, is being a part of a team, a part of a group. We have so much negative peer pressure in our lives. Being a part of a group that exerts positive peer pressure is such a blessing. I mean, it's such a like the people that I'm around with in jujitsu, they tend to eat healthy. They tend to be worried about nutrition and sleep, and we all support each other because we're all going through the same hard things. So, talk a little bit about how important it is to find a group that exerts positive peer pressure that pushes you to be better instead of to be worse.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a topic that I talk about all the time and one that I think is absolutely critical, especially to the person who's trying to find themselves and trying to get their footing. Your environment is just so critical to taking that step and being able to unleash whatever potential you have. The reason why perhaps you haven't met your potential is because you've put yourself in an environment that's holding it back. And
Yep.
sometimes that calls for you to, again, step outside your comfort zone, and to take a risk and put yourself around people who are doing the things that you want to be doing, whether that's, in athletics or any other arena for that matter. And it definitely is something that people sometimes shy away from, but it's effective 100% of the time. That's the crazy thing about it is
Yeah.
it's never ineffective, right? Like you're never going to it's like they say, right? You're the average of the five people you hang around the most.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and it's so true. It's just a matter of are you willing to change those five people that are currently around you for another set of five people? And if the answer to that question is no, you need to ask yourself why. What are you holding on to?
Yeah.
And are you holding on to it perhaps because of some, past trauma where you feel guilty, leaving it? Is it because you don't feel like you'll ever work with a group of people who are quote unquote better at you at a certain craft and you feel like you need to address that, and that takes some work. And I believe where I did that work was when I was alone in that dark room in that studio.
Yeah.
I needed to slowly, just slowly uncover that I could just be in their aura and then build up the courage to ask questions and to be inquisitive and to ask them if I could join in certain things. So it's not overnight. And that's I think a common theme to a lot of this, right? I know a lot of what we're talking about has parallels with athletics, and I think that's great. Obviously, it's a big part of both of our lives, but I'll give another example. When I wrote my first book, I Googled how to write a book. I didn't know how to write a book. No idea what it entailed. And I remember I was sitting at my desk at the bank. My boss was in Houston at the time. I knew my job inside and out, so I could basically do my job in 2, 3 hours, and then I'd have time to kill. So I also Googled how many words you need to write to reach 100 pages. And it was 20,000 words, just because I an arbitrary number. And I started bringing my personal laptop to work, and I would take my lunch breaks, and every day I was just typing away. And in about 3 months, I hit the quote unquote 100 pages. I didn't know what to do with it. It was just a long Word document. I reached out to a friend who went to Harvard and I said, "Hey, you've got to know somebody that's published." He did. That person looked at it. He said, "This looks good. Can I give you my editor?" And I was like, "Sure." Like, again, no idea how much it would cost me to publish a book. And the editor was great. I mean, he was a lifesaver. But one of the most important things that he taught me was he looked at it, he said, your content's really good, but having a book isn't just about having good content. Having a book is actually about giving the reader a reason to flip from the first page to the last page. You need to literally make your point on every page to justify them flipping it to the next page. And I had never thought about it like that. And so he gave me an assignment. He goes, "I want you to think about the 40 most critical moments of your life. I want you to write them on a postcard. And then I want you to write 1,000 words for each of those moments." So all of a sudden, I went from 20,000 words to another 40,000 words. So I had a total of 60,000 words. And I had a lot of reasons to be deflated after that exercise because I thought, hey, like I've got really, really good content. He said I had really good content. And after I did that exercise slightly begrudgingly, but also, humbly knowing that he probably knew better than I did about actually publishing a book, it became more abundantly clear to me around how it's not so much about the final product as it was about that entire journey of Googling how to write a book, being humbled by his advice, thinking of 40 moments, writing 1,000 words for each of those moments. So when it came time to do the book release, yeah, I was relieved. I was excited this book was coming out. But what I remember most was just this process and what I learned through that process. The 2 a.m. nights, on the phone with him, reading word for word through the book, and fighting to keep certain things out, or taking things and placing them, and given the book was a personal memoir, there were certain things that were personal that he said, "Hey, like this doesn't give the reader a reason to keep going," and I think that's symbolic of a lot of the things that we do in life. We don't realize the importance of the process throughout, and that could apply to essentially everything here,
Yeah.
with or within, with or without, within or without the world of athletics.
So back to the athletic example, uh, it used to be my goal to be a black belt in jiu-jitsu. It used to be my goal to be a scratch golfer, and I will eventually be a black belt in jiu-jitsu. I don't know if I'll ever be a scratch golfer, but those aren't really my goals anymore. Those are secondary. Now I'm
Mm.
more worried about the process. I'm more worried about breaking down my golf swing and doing it correctly from the very beginning, which I'm not really that's not my personality. I just want to go out there and just whack at it, but I want to be deliberate about what I do. I want to have a plan. I want to execute that plan, and I want to keep notes about how I'm succeeding in that plan. And so I think that's a fantastic point. I'll tell you, uh, there's so much wisdom in what you're saying, Bishoy, about so many different topics. We could literally talk for
We could talk
hours.
for days.
We could talk for days about this. But one of the things I've noticed that you do so well, and one of the reasons I think you're such a fantastic communicator, and this is a big secret to people, by the way. I'm about to tell people what the most powerful thing in human history is and has been, and that's stories. Because
Mm.
that's how ideas are communicated from one human to another. It's how ideas have been communicated since humans have been sitting around campfires communicating ideas. And you're a great storyteller.
Thank
And
you.
one of the reasons I think you've been so successful in your career is you're not just regurgitating information. You're telling actual stories from a real life, and that is very, very engaging to people. And so I wanted to mention to you. I've had multiple people on my podcast that are experts in speeches and presentations and authors. And I literally have a reminder on my phone that pops up every morning that says tell stories.
Mm.
And in fact, I would go so far as to say stories are more powerful than militaries. Stories are what send militaries to war to begin
Yeah.
with. I would go so far as to argue that it's impossible for the human mind to think absent stories. So, for example, if I give you a whole list of numbers, the first thing your mind's going to do is try to tell a story about that numbers. If I were just say 5, 8, 9, 372, 21, your brain would start going, what's the story behind that? Your brain would start constructing a story. So, well, Bashoy, I've kept you for almost an hour, and we you're about to have your second daughter. Your wife, you said, was very, very pregnant.
Yeah.
My
I did
daughter
I
is
did warn Brian that if I had to call this episode short, it's because I'd probably have to run to the hospital.
well, and my daughter, who is about to be a junior in high school, is playing her first volleyball game here in a little
Amazing.
while, and so I'm going to go watch her first volleyball game. We have a little tradition every game day in the morning. I text her some sort of funny GIF of like somebody getting hit in the face with a
Huh.
volleyball or something, and I say "Game Day" with exclamation mark, and
I love
so
that.
she's really excited. But congratulations to you on what will soon be your second daughter. And
Thank you.
I really want to keep this conversation going. I think there's at least 4 or 5 other really big topics that I'd like to talk to you about. So I'd ask that maybe you might want to come on for a part two at some point.
Absolutely. It would be my honor. I mean, like I said, very few people have been able to flip the switch with me on certain topics. And that's a testimony to you, Brian. That's a testimony to your lived experiences, and how you apply those experiences, not only in navigating your life on your own, but for the path that you want to build for your children. And that's something that I have the utmost respect for, and something that, I hope to not only learn from, but apply with my own children.
Well, that's super nice of you to say, and I appreciate that a lot, Bashoy. So before I let you go, tell people where they can find you. Tell people about both of your books and your podcast, and if they want to get in contact with you, how they would do that.
Absolutely. For anyone that wants to get in contact with me, I'm accessible through social media on Instagram at Bishoy Tadros or on LinkedIn. Those are the two forms that I probably use the most. You can purchase my books either on Amazon or my website, www.bishoytadros.com. I think I threw in an extra W there. My first book, Break Barriers, is my memoir. That's my baby. I wrote that book to help people channel the mindset to overcome obstacles, personal, professional, or on the playing field. My second book is called Audacious, Uncaging Your Authentic Self. That was a thought leadership piece to help people channel the mindset to accomplish their most daunting of goals. I talk about how, essentially anything is possible with the right mindset. And then lastly, the podcast, Mile 40. You can find it on any major streaming platform, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. I'd really appreciate if you gave it a check out.
Bishoy Tadros, thank you for coming on the show. It's great to see you again, my friend. Keep
Thank
doing
you,
what you're
Brian.
doing. You're doing great work.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you for having me on.